The autumn wind rustled through the trees as a young girl hurried down Cedar Street, her footsteps echoing against the concrete sidewalk. The sun was setting earlier these days, casting long shadows across the suburban neighborhood. She had stayed at the library longer than planned, losing track of time while working on her history project. Now, at 6:45 p.m., the streetlights were beginning to flicker on one by one. It started with just a feeling, that tingling sensation on the back of your neck when something isn't quite right. She first noticed the black SUV when she was passing the old pharmacy. It crawled by slowly, too slowly for a normal driver, before turning right at the intersection. She told herself she was being paranoid, but her heart started beating faster anyway. 3 minutes later, the same vehicle appeared again, this time from a different direction. The windows were tinted dark, making it impossible to see who was inside. The girl clutched her backpack tighter, her knuckles turning white. She quickened her pace, trying to remember everything her mom had taught her about staying safe. "Hey, sweetie, need a ride?" A man's voice called out as the SUV pulled up alongside her. She kept walking, eyes straight ahead, pretending not to hear. Her legs felt like jelly, but she forced them to move faster. The vehicle stayed parallel to her, moving at her walking pace. "Come on, it's getting dark. We just want to help." The girl's mind raced. She was still 10 blocks from home, and the streets were eerily empty. Most families were probably inside, having dinner or helping with homework. She could feel panic rising in her chest, threatening to overwhelm her. That's when she spotted the house with the bright porch light. An elderly woman stood there, peacefully watering her flower boxes, seemingly unaware of the drama unfolding on her quiet street. The girl noticed how the porch light cast a warm, welcoming glow, like a beacon of hope. The woman's silver hair was neatly pulled back, and she wore a comfortable-looking cardigan despite the mild evening temperature. The SUV had disappeared around the corner again, but the girl knew it would be back. She had to make a decision fast. Her mom always said that if you're in trouble, look for another mom or an older woman, someone who might understand, someone who would help without asking too many questions first. With trembling legs, she changed direction, heading straight for the porch. She could hear her own breathing, shallow and rapid, as she climbed the 3 steps. The wooden boards creaked under her feet, announcing her presence before she could speak. The old woman looked up from her plants, her eyes crinkling with concern as she took in the girl's frightened expression. Before either of them could say anything, the sound of an engine grew louder. The SUV was making another pass. Standing in the shadow of the porch roof, the girl watched as the vehicle slowed down, its tinted windows reflecting the last rays of sunlight. Her whole body was shaking now, but something about the elderly woman's presence made her feel safer, like finding shelter in the middle of a storm. Time seemed to stand still as she gathered her courage to speak, to ask for help, to trust this stranger who somehow didn't feel like a stranger at all. The woman's garden tools clinked softly as she set them down, her movements deliberate and calm, as if she already understood that something was very wrong. In those few seconds before the girl whispered her plea for help, she noticed small details about the porch, the sweet smell of the flowers in the hanging baskets, a worn welcome mat that had faded in the sun, and a small wind chime that tinkled softly in the evening breeze. These ordinary things somehow gave her the strength to find her voice and ask for the help she desperately needed. The elderly woman had lived in her little blue house for over 40 years, and she'd seen just about everything from her front porch. She loved spending her evenings there, tending to her flowers and watching the neighborhood life unfold. But something was different tonight. Her weathered hands paused midair, still holding the watering can, as she watched the young girl approaching her steps. There was fear in those young eyes, the kind of fear that made the old woman's teacher instincts kick in immediately. She'd spent 35 years in front of a classroom, and she knew that look. It wasn't the kind of worry you'd see before a big test or after missing homework. No, this was raw fear, the type that made her own heart skip a beat. She noticed how the girl's school backpack was clutched tightly against her chest, like a shield. Her sweater was slightly askew, probably from running or walking too quickly. The old woman had always trusted her gut feelings, and right now, every instinct was telling her something was terribly wrong. Setting down her watering can with deliberate slowness, she kept her movements gentle and predictable, just like she used to do when approaching frightened students. The evening air had grown cooler, and the street lamps cast long shadows across her beloved flower beds. A car engine rumbled somewhere nearby, and she didn't miss how the girl's shoulders tensed at the sound. The porch light cast a warm glow around them, creating a small circle of safety. Wind chimes tinkled softly overhead, the ones her late husband had hung there years ago. She'd always found their gentle music soothing, and now she hoped they might offer some comfort to this scared child standing before her. Her mind was already working through possibilities. Should she invite the girl inside right away? Call for help? She'd learned long ago that sometimes the best first step was simply to listen. Her neighbors often joked that she was the neighborhood's unofficial grandmother, always ready with a kind word or a cookie for anyone who stopped by. Tonight, she sensed she needed to be much more than that. The girl's shoes made a soft scuffing sound on the wooden steps as she came closer. The old woman could see she was trembling, despite the mild evening temperature. Years of experience had taught her that sometimes silence was the best invitation to speak. She simply stood there, her face showing nothing but gentle concern, giving the girl space to find her voice. Through her screen door, she could smell the apple pie she'd baked earlier that afternoon. Such a normal, comfortable smell on what was turning into anything but a normal evening. She noticed how the girl kept glancing over her shoulder, checking the street behind her. Each time headlights swept past the house, the young one would flinch slightly. Her porch had always been her favorite spot for watching the world go by, the place where neighborhood children would stop to admire her flowers, where parents would pause to chat while walking their dogs, where she'd wave to joggers and cyclists as they passed. But right now, it felt like a fortress, a safe harbor in what she was beginning to suspect was a very dangerous storm. She thought about her own granddaughters, about how vulnerable young people could be in today's world. The maternal instinct to protect, honed by decades of teaching and raising her own family, surged through her. Whatever trouble this child was in, she would help. She'd already decided that before the girl even opened her mouth to speak. A black SUV rolled past her house, moving unusually slowly. The old woman's eyes narrowed slightly as she watched it through her flowers. In all her years of porch sitting, she'd learned to spot things that didn't belong, and that vehicle definitely didn't belong on her quiet street. She shifted her position slightly, moving to stand between the girl and the street view, creating a human barrier that spoke of protection without saying a word. The moment had come. Standing close to the elderly woman, the girl's voice trembled as she leaned in, barely louder than a whisper. "Please help me," she breathed, her words catching in her throat. "There's a black SUV, 2 men. They've been following me since I left the library." The old woman felt her blood run cold, but years of handling classroom crises helped her maintain a calm exterior. Her keen eyes scanned the street while pretending to check her flower baskets. Sure enough, there it was, the black SUV crawling past her house again, like a shark circling its prey. The vehicle's windows were tinted so dark they seemed to swallow the evening light. She noticed there was no license plate on the front, another detail that made her stomach tighten with worry. The girl continued whispering, her voice shaking more with each word. "They tried to get me to get in their car. Twice. They said they just wanted to give me a ride. But—" She stopped, choking back tears. "I saw them earlier, watching me through the library windows. I thought maybe I was imagining things, but then they followed me when I left." The old woman's mind was already working on a plan. She needed to get the girl inside to safety without alerting the men in the SUV that anything was wrong. She could see them slowing down again at the end of the street, preparing to make another pass. Her heart was pounding, but her voice remained steady and clear. A lifetime of dealing with children had taught her that sometimes the best way to calm someone is to give them something specific to focus on. She noticed how the girl's hands were trembling, her knuckles white from gripping her backpack. "Can you tell me what they look like?" she asked softly, while pretending to deadhead some petunias. "Try to remember every detail." The girl took a shaky breath. The driver was wearing a baseball cap, dark blue, I think. He had a beard. She paused, gathering her thoughts. The other man was bigger, with a gray hoodie. They both looked mean. Their eyes. She shuddered, unable to finish the thought. Just then, the SUV made another pass. The old woman could feel the girl pressing closer to her, trying to hide behind her flowering plants. The vehicle's engine seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet evening air, its low rumble like a growl. Through the heavily tinted windows, she caught a glimpse of movement, someone leaning forward, looking intently at her porch. Her mind flashed back to the news story she'd seen just last week about attempted abductions in the neighboring county. The details had been similar. A dark SUV, two men, young girls walking alone. She'd lived long enough to know that coincidences like this were rarely coincidences at all. The wind chimes above them tinkled softly, a gentle sound that seemed out of place in the tense moment. A few autumn leaves skittered across her porch, and somewhere down the street, a dog barked. These ordinary sounds of a peaceful evening felt surreal now, like a backdrop to something much darker. The girl's next whispered words confirmed the old woman's worst fears. "They've been circling the blocks. I tried going different ways, but they kept finding me. When I crossed this street, they pulled up next to me, and the passenger tried to open his door." Her voice cracked. "I ran. That's when I saw you on your porch." Looking at the terrified young face before her, the old woman felt a fierce protectiveness surge through her. In her decades of teaching, she'd helped students through all sorts of troubles, family problems, bullying, even abuse. But this was different. This was immediate danger, and she knew the next few minutes would be crucial. She could hear the SUV's engine again, growing louder as it approached for another pass. The girl's breathing quickened, and the old woman could feel her trembling increase. Without moving her lips much, she whispered back, "Don't worry, dear. I'm going to help you. But first, we need to make a very important phone call." The old woman's mind raced as she put her plan into action. Years of handling school emergencies had taught her that appearing calm was just as important as being calm. With a warm smile that didn't match her racing heart, she called out loudly enough for anyone nearby to hear, "Oh, sweetheart. I'm so glad you made it for dinner. Your mother called to say you might be running late." Her voice carried naturally across the front yard, masking their fear with ordinary conversation. The girl, quickly understanding the strategy, managed a wobbly smile. The old woman gently guided her toward the front door, keeping herself between the girl and the street. Her fingers, though stiffened by age and arthritis, were already pulling her cell phone from her cardigan pocket. Inside, the house smelled of fresh-baked apple pie and potpourri. Any other time, it would have been welcoming, but right now, neither of them noticed. The old woman locked the door behind them, then quickly moved them away from the windows. Her living room, with its comfortable floral sofa and family photos, became a sanctuary. "Sit down, dear," she said softly, guiding the girl to the couch while keeping her voice steady. Her hand shook slightly as she dialed 911, but her voice remained clear and controlled. The girl huddled into the corner of the sofa, making herself as small as possible, while the old woman positioned herself where she could peek through the lace curtains without being obvious. The 911 operator's voice crackled through the phone. 911. What's your emergency?" The old woman spoke quietly but firmly, years of handling school crises evident in her tone. "Hello. I'm calling from 1542 Oak Street. I have a young girl with me who's being followed by two men in a black SUV. They've been trying to get her into their vehicle. She could see the SUV making another slow pass by her house. Her free hand clutched the back of her armchair, but her voice remained steady as she continued giving details to the dispatcher. No front license plate, heavily tinted windows. The driver's wearing a dark blue baseball cap, has a beard. Passenger in a gray hoodie, larger built. The girl on the sofa was still trembling, her backpack clutched to her chest like a shield. The old woman grabbed a warm throw blanket and gently draped it around her shoulders while staying on the line. Yes, they're still in the area, she reported to the dispatcher. They've circled the block several times in the last few minutes. Through her curtains, she watched the SUV slow down again in front of her house. This time, it almost came to a complete stop. Her heart pounded as she saw the passenger window start to roll down. "They're stopping outside my house right now," she whispered into the phone. The dispatcher assured her units were already on the way. Years of teaching had given her an almost sixth sense about trouble, and right now, every instinct was screaming that these men weren't going to give up easily. She kept one eye on the street while asking the dispatcher, "How far away are your officers?" When the answer came, 3 minutes. It felt like an eternity. The girl's soft voice broke through the tension. "My mom. She doesn't know where I am." The old woman nodded understanding, still keeping watch through the curtains. To the dispatcher, she added, "We'll need to contact her parents." She was walking home from the library when this started. Headlights swept across her living room walls as the SUV made another pass. The old woman's grip tightened on her phone as she noticed something new. The vehicle was moving even slower this time, and she could see shadows moving inside, gesturing. These men were getting bolder, more frustrated. She knew from her years of dealing with troubled students that frustration could make people dangerous. The familiar sound of her wind chimes drifted in from the porch, somehow making the situation feel even more surreal. Here she was, in her familiar living room with its comfortable furniture and family photos, facing something that felt like it belonged in a crime show rather than her quiet neighborhood. But one look at the frightened girl on her sofa reminded her why she needed to stay strong and calm. The 911 dispatcher's voice remained steady and reassuring through the phone as the old woman continued providing details. "The SUV just passed my house again," she reported, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "They're getting more aggressive with each pass." She could feel her heart thumping against her ribs, but years of handling school emergencies helped her maintain her composure. Through the lace curtains, she watched as the vehicle made yet another slow circuit. The passenger was now leaning out the window slightly, trying to peer into her home. Her fingers gripped the phone tighter as she described everything to the dispatcher. "The larger man in the hoodie keeps looking toward my house. They know she's here." The girl on the sofa had pulled her knees up to her chest, making herself as small as possible. The old woman's heart ached at the sight. She looked so young, so vulnerable. Without taking her eyes off the street, she asked the girl gently, "What's your mother's phone number, dear? The police will need to contact her." As the girl recited her mother's number, her voice shaking, the dispatcher confirmed that officers were converging on the area from multiple directions. "They're coming without sirens to avoid alerting the suspects," the dispatcher explained. The old woman nodded, even though she knew the dispatcher couldn't see her. Every minute felt like an hour. The familiar sounds of her neighborhood continued outside. Dogs barking in distant yards, the rustle of leaves in the autumn breeze, the gentle tinkle of her wind chimes. But now these peaceful sounds felt almost mocking against the dangerous situation unfolding. She watched as the SUV made another pass, this time moving even slower. "There's something else," the old woman said into the phone, her voice tight with concern. "The vehicle's brakes are squealing slightly. You can hear it when they slow down." She knew from her teaching days that details matter. The more information she could provide, the better chance of catching these men. The girl suddenly gasped, pressing herself further into the sofa. "I remember something else," she whispered. When they first pulled up beside me, I saw a sticker in the back window. It was red and white. Looked like some kind of sports team logo. The old woman quickly relayed this information to the dispatcher. From her position by the window, she could see the SUV had parked at the end of her street. Its headlights were off, but the engine was still running. She described this to the dispatcher, her voice remaining calm even as her concern grew. These men were waiting, watching, probably trying to decide what to do next. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the phone. Units are 1 minute out. Please stay away from the windows. The old woman moved back slightly but kept watching. Her teacher's instinct told her these next few moments would be crucial. She'd seen that same predatory patience in school bullies waiting for their chance. These men weren't giving up. She glanced at the terrified girl on her sofa, then back to the street. The SUV's engine revved slightly, and she could see it beginning to move again, this time much more purposefully. They're starting to move, she reported, her voice urgent but controlled. They're coming back toward the house. The girl whimpered softly, and the old woman moved to sit beside her, putting a gentle arm around her shoulders while keeping the phone pressed to her ear. It's all right, dear, she soothed. Help is almost here. She could feel the girl trembling against her side and silently prayed the police would arrive in time. Just then, she heard it, the distant sound of vehicles approaching from multiple directions. The SUV must have heard it too, because its engine revved louder. Through her curtains, she watched as the vehicle suddenly accelerated. They're moving fast now, she reported to the dispatcher. They must have heard the police coming. The next few moments seemed to happen in slow motion. The SUV's tires squealed as it tried to make a quick turn at the end of her street. At the same moment, the first police cruiser appeared, its lights flashing but sirens still silent. The old woman held her breath, her arm tightening protectively around the girl beside her. The chase was about to begin. The waiting was the hardest part. The old woman kept one arm around the trembling girl while holding her phone tight with the other hand. Time seemed to slow down as they sat there in her cozy living room, the ticking of her grandfather clock marking each endless second. The smell of apple pie still lingered in the air, a strangely comforting scent in such a tense moment. Would you like some tea, dear? She asked softly, trying to create a sense of normalcy. The girl shook her head, her eyes fixed on the window. The old woman understood. She couldn't have swallowed anything either. Instead, she pulled the blanket tighter around the girl's shoulders and continued her quiet watch. Through her lace curtains, she could see the black SUV still circling the neighborhood. Each time it passed, her heart would speed up a little more. The vehicle's engine had a distinctive rumble now that she'd heard it so many times. A deep, threatening sound that seemed to echo through her quiet street. They're making another pass, she reported to the dispatcher, who had stayed on the line with them. The old woman's voice remained steady, though her hands were shaking slightly. She'd handled many crisis situations during her teaching years, but this was different. This was the kind of danger she'd always warned her students about. The girl beside her suddenly spoke up, her voice barely a whisper. My mom. She always told me to trust my instincts. When those men first pulled up beside me, something just felt wrong. The old woman nodded, remembering all the times she'd given similar advice to her students. You did exactly the right thing, coming here for help. Outside, a dog started barking frantically, the kind of bark that meant something was wrong. The old woman peered carefully through the curtains again. The SUV had stopped at the end of her street, its headlights off, but engine still running. She could see shadows moving inside the vehicle, probably the men discussing their next move. The police are almost here, the dispatcher assured them. Multiple units are converging on your location. Just stay inside and away from the windows. The old woman relayed this information to the girl, watching as some of the tension eased from her young shoulders. The grandfather clock in the corner struck the half hour, its gentle chime seeming unnaturally loud in the quiet room. The girl jumped at the sound, and the old woman squeezed her shoulder reassuringly. "My husband picked that clock out 30 years ago," she said softly, trying to distract her. "He always said its chime reminded him of church bells from his childhood." Her casual words were interrupted by the sound of the SUV's engine revving. Through the curtains, she could see it starting to move again, this time more slowly than before. "They're coming back," she whispered into the phone. The vehicle crept down the street like a predator stalking its prey. The girl pressed closer to her side, trembling. The old woman could feel her fear, but she also noticed something else. Anger. This young girl's evening had been ruined, her sense of safety shattered, by two men who had no right to cause such fear. The retired teacher felt her own anger rising, but she kept her voice calm and steady. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as they waited. The old woman's eyes never left the window, watching as the SUV made its slow approach. Her living room, usually so comfortable with its familiar furniture and family photos, felt like a fortress now. The wind chimes on her porch tinkled softly, their gentle sound a stark contrast to the tension of the moment. "Units are turning onto your street now," the dispatcher's voice crackled through the phone. The old woman strained her ears, and yes, she could hear it too. The faint sound of multiple engines approaching, the slight squeal of tires turning corners quickly. Help was finally coming. She glanced down at the girl beside her, seeing a glimmer of hope beginning to replace the fear in her eyes. They both knew the next few moments would be crucial. The SUV was still out there, its occupants growing more desperate with each passing minute. But now, finally, the tables were about to turn. The police arrived like silent guardians, their cars appearing from different directions with lights flashing but sirens off. The old woman watched through her curtains as two patrol cars smoothly boxed in the black SUV just 3 houses down from hers. It happened so quickly. One moment, the predators were hunting, the next they were trapped. "They've got them," she whispered to the girl, her arm still protectively wrapped around the young shoulders. The dispatcher on the phone confirmed what they were seeing. "Officers have the vehicle surrounded. You're safe now." Those words seemed to release something in both of them, and they let out breaths they hadn't realized they were holding. Through the lace curtains, they could see the scene unfolding like a TV drama, except this was terrifyingly real. Police officers approached the SUV with practiced caution, their movements precise and coordinated. The old woman noticed how they positioned themselves strategically, their training evident in every step. "Get out of the vehicle with your hands where we can see them." The officer's command carried clearly through the quiet evening air. The girl pressed closer to the old woman's side as they watched the driver's door slowly open. The man in the blue baseball cap emerged, his hands raised. Even from a distance, the old woman could see the anger in his movements. The passenger door opened next, and the larger man in the gray hoodie stepped out. The old woman felt a chill run down her spine as she got her first clear look at him. There was something cold in his expression that reminded her of the worst troublemakers she'd encountered in her teaching career, the ones who enjoyed causing fear. More police cars arrived, their red and blue lights painting the peaceful suburban street in alternating colors. Neighbors were beginning to peek out of their houses, drawn by the commotion. The old woman recognized Mrs. Chen from next door standing on her porch, still holding the novel she'd probably been reading before all this started. The officers moved with efficient precision as they handcuffed both men. One officer opened the SUV's trunk, and the old woman heard the girl beside her gasp. Even from their position behind the curtains, they could see the rope and duct tape inside. The old woman pulled the girl closer, silently thanking whatever guardian angel had led this child to her porch. "The police need to check the back of the vehicle," the dispatcher explained through the phone. "They've found some concerning items." The old woman didn't need the explanation. She could see the grim expressions on the officers' faces as they documented everything in the trunk. A female officer was now walking toward her house, her badge catching the light from the street lamps. The dispatcher spoke again. "Officer Wilson is coming to take your statements." You can end this call now." The old woman thanked the dispatcher, amazed at how the woman's calm voice had helped anchor them through this ordeal. The girl was still trembling slightly, but there was relief in her eyes now. "I can't believe this is real," she whispered. "When I left the library, everything was so normal." The old woman squeezed her shoulder gently. "Sometimes the scariest moments come on ordinary days, dear. That's why we have to look out for each other." A knock at the door made them both jump, but the female officer's voice was reassuring. "Police Department. I'm Officer Wilson." The old woman got up to answer it, her legs a bit shaky from sitting tensely for so long. Through her front window, she could see the two men being placed in separate patrol cars, their expressions dark with thwarted anger. As she opened the door to the officer, more cars were pulling up, detectives, from the looks of their unmarked vehicles. The old woman could hear her wind chimes tinkling gently, the same peaceful sound they'd made all evening. How strange that they'd witnessed both the darkness and light of human nature in the span of less than an hour. The female officer stepped inside, her presence bringing an air of official competence to the living room. "You're both very brave," she said warmly, taking out her notebook. "Those men were wanted in connection with 2 other attempted abductions. Your call tonight probably prevented more girls from being targeted." The sound of running footsteps on the porch made everyone look up. The girls' parents had arrived, their faces etched with worry and relief. The mother burst through the door that Officer Wilson held open, rushing straight to her daughter. Their embrace was tight and desperate, filled with all the fear and love that only a parent could understand. My baby," the mother kept whispering, tears streaming down her face as she held her daughter close. The father stood nearby, one hand on his daughter's shoulder, the other wiping his eyes. The old woman watched from her armchair, her own eyes growing misty at the reunion. These were the moments that made all the fear worth it. The living room, which had felt like a fortress of safety just moments ago, now buzzed with activity. Officer Wilson continued taking statements while 2 detectives arrived to gather more details. The father kept looking out the window at the police cars, his jaw tightening every time he caught sight of the black SUV being searched. "We tried calling your cell phone," the mother explained, finally loosening her grip on her daughter. "When you didn't answer, we called the library. They said you'd left almost an hour ago." Her voice cracked. "We were just getting in the car to look for you when the police called." The girl's hand tightened around her backpack strap. Her phone was inside, still unsilent from being in the library. The old woman noticed how the girl's father kept pacing, his movements showing the helpless anger of a parent who couldn't protect his child. She understood. As a teacher, she'd seen that same look on parents' faces during difficult situations. But this time, there was a happy ending. Her porch light had been a beacon of hope when it was needed most. Detective Barnes, a kind-faced woman with graying hair, sat down with the family to explain what they'd found. "The men in the SUV are known to law enforcement," she said gently. "They've been suspected in 2 other attempted abductions in nearby counties, but we never had enough evidence to make arrests." She paused, looking at the girl with respect. "Your daughter's quick thinking and your call changed that." The father's voice was rough with emotion. "What did they have in that car?" The detective shared a look with Officer Wilson before answering carefully. "Let's just say the evidence we found confirms their intentions weren't good. But thanks to your daughter's instincts and this lovely lady's help, they won't be able to hurt anyone else." The mother hadn't let go of her daughter's hand, as if afraid she might disappear. "How can we ever thank you?" she asked the old woman, tears still shining in her eyes. The old woman smiled gently, remembering all the times in her teaching career when she'd helped students through various crises. "Seeing her safe with you is all the thanks I need." Outside, the police lights still painted the neighborhood in alternating red and blue. Neighbors had gathered in small groups on their lawns, watching as evidence was collected and photos taken. The old woman's wind chimes continued their gentle song, a reminder that peace would return to their street. Officer Wilson finished taking statements and stood up, tucking away her notebook. "You've got a very brave daughter," she told the parents. "And you," she turned to the old woman, "your quick thinking and calm handling of the situation made all the difference." The old woman just nodded, feeling tired but grateful. The girl, still holding her mother's hand, suddenly spoke up. "I remembered what my teachers always said about looking for help from other women, especially moms or older ladies." She looked at the old woman with tear-filled eyes. "When I saw you on your porch with your flowers, something just told me you would help." The father had finally stopped pacing. He stood by the window, watching as the police cars began to leave one by one, their job finished. The black SUV was now empty, sealed with evidence tape. "They're taking it to the crime lab," Detective Barnes explained. "The evidence inside will help build a strong case." The mother pulled out a tissue from her purse, wiping her eyes. "I can't believe this happened on our quiet street," she said softly. The old woman smiled gently, her teacher's wisdom showing in her words. "Sometimes angels wear cardigans and water flowers," she said, "and sometimes help comes from the most ordinary places." In the months that followed that terrifying evening, something beautiful began to grow from the seeds of fear. The girl started visiting the old woman regularly, initially bringing thank-you cookies baked with her mother, but soon the visits became about much more than gratitude. The front porch, that had once been a sanctuary in crisis, became a place of friendship and learning. 3 times the week after school, the girl would appear with her backpack full of books. The old woman would be there in her familiar spot, tending to her flowers or simply enjoying the fresh air. They'd sit together on the comfortable porch chairs, talking about everything from homework to life's bigger questions. The retired teacher found herself sharing wisdom earned from decades in the classroom, while the young girl brought fresh perspectives and energy to their conversations. "Your flowers are amazing," the girl said one autumn afternoon, helping to plant new bulbs for spring. "I never knew there was so much to learn about gardening." The old woman smiled, remembering how she'd once taught science lessons using her garden as a classroom. Now, these peaceful moments of planting and pruning were healing them both. The neighborhood had changed, too. What happened that night had awakened something in the community. Neighbors who had once just waved in passing now stopped to chat. A community watch program was formed, with the old woman's porch becoming an unofficial meeting spot. Parents felt more confident letting their children play outside, knowing that watchful eyes were keeping them safe. The girl's parents became regular visitors as well. Her mother often brought homemade treats, and they'd all sit together, sharing stories and building bonds that went far beyond the circumstances that had brought them together. The father had installed better lighting along the street, inspiring other neighbors to do the same. One day, the girl arrived with exciting news. "I started a safety awareness club at school," she announced proudly. "We're teaching other kids about trusting their instincts and finding safe people to help them." The old woman felt tears welling up in her eyes. This young girl had turned her frightening experience into something positive, something that could help others. The police department invited them both to speak at community safety meetings. The girl would share her story, emphasizing how she trusted her instincts when something felt wrong. The old woman would talk about the importance of being observant and caring neighbors. Their story inspired other communities to start similar programs. As winter turned to spring, and spring bloomed into summer, their friendship continued to grow. The girl learned about gardening, baking, and life wisdom from the old woman. In return, she helped the older woman navigate her smartphone and taught her about social media. They laughed together when the old woman's first attempt at taking a selfie caught most of the sky and her forehead. The front porch became a symbol of hope in the neighborhood. Other young people started stopping by, drawn by the cheerful flowers and the warm welcome they always received. The old woman found herself surrounded by young energy again, reminiscent of her teaching days. She started offering homework help, and soon her porch became an after-school haven for many students. "You know," the girl said one evening as they watered the flowers together, I used to think scary things only happened in movies or faraway places. But now I understand that real heroes don't wear capes. They wear cardigans and grow beautiful gardens. The old woman chuckled at this, but her heart swelled with affection. The police officers who had helped that night sometimes drove by, waving and stopping occasionally for a chat. Officer Wilson made it a point to check in regularly, usually bringing coffee and updates about how their case had helped catch other criminals. The two men from the SUV had been convicted, their testimony leading to arrests in other cases. As the one-year anniversary of that fateful evening approached, the neighborhood organized a community celebration. They gathered on and around the old woman's porch, families, police officers, neighbors, all sharing food and stories. The girl stood up to make a speech, her voice strong and clear. "Sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes," she said, looking around at the faces of her neighbors. "That night taught me that heroes are everywhere. They're the neighbors who watch out for each other, the teachers who share their wisdom, and the ordinary people who choose to care." She smiled at the old woman. "And sometimes they're just wonderful ladies who water their flowers at exactly the right moment."